Welcome to this session where we're chatting about inclusive education. In these conversations, we share perspectives of people who are doing interesting things and have thoughts and ideas about inclusive education in Canada. I'm Gordon Porter, the Director of Inclusive Education Canada, and my co-hosts today are Diane Richler, who's the chair of the Catalyst for Inclusive Education Initiative of Inclusion International, and a former executive vice president of what's now Inclusion Canada, but used to be called the Canadian Association for Community Living. My second co-host is Jackie Speck, who's the director of the Canadian Research Centre on Inclusive Education at Western University in London, Ontario, and a professor of education at Western. The three of us are going to chat today with Julie Stone. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you very much.
And Julie is an educator in New Brunswick. She's been a teacher, an early childhood teacher, a resource teacher, a consultant, a director of student services, and she's worked as a consultant throughout Canada and many other parts of North America and the world, in fact. Julie's also a past president of both the New Brunswick Association for Community Living and, again, what's now known as Inclusion Canada. So we're really pleased to have her with us today. And Julie, let's begin by asking you if you could just reflect how you happened to get into this business of inclusive education. Can you share some thoughts on that?
Wow, I have to go back quite a long way. I was working at a preschool, a privately run preschool in New Brunswick in Nackawic. And a student came to my classroom who had autism. And I worked with her in my classroom and got along very well. And she was a happy little girl there. Then she went on to elementary school, and I became the resource teacher at the elementary school and worked there for a few years. And then began the journey of working at the district level, working with schools and teachers in a particular zone in New Brunswick. I think at one time I was working in 43 schools. And so that's sort of how it all began. And during that time, of course, I met Gordon, and he invited me to become the secretary for the New Brunswick Association for Community Living because the secretary had retired. And he said it would probably only be for 1 year and there'd be 2 meetings. And here I am. And
That was a lie, no doubt.
It was a lie, but I don't regret any of it. I don't regret working with the association and volunteering and working with them. And also the work I have done in the schools. It's been very rewarding and very interesting. And I wouldn't change it for anything.
Let's go back a little bit.
Okay.
When you were working as a method and resource teacher in that elementary school, they'd never heard of the idea of inclusion before. They may have had a few students who were challenging from time to time, but you were sort of the initial soldier marching in to support something that hadn't been done before.
Right.
What was that initial experience like, and how did you make it work?
Well, it was very challenging because the principal of the school, although a very nice person, had not had the experience of working in a school where there were students with any kind of what we would call intellectual or cognitive disability. And some of the staff people were actually very angry that I had come into a school and assumed a role as a methods teacher, thinking to themselves, what's wrong with me? I mean, why can't I do it, that sort of thing. The other thing that was a challenge is that we decided, and Gordon was in on these decisions, that we would take two students, one who had autism, and one who had quite severe cerebral palsy, and she did not have verbal language. The girl with autism, who was going into grade 1, did have some language, but didn't always use it appropriately. She had echolalia and she perseverated on things. So carrying on a conversation with her wasn't always possible, depending on her mood, I guess you might say, that day. So those were two challenges, one in grade 4 and one in grade 1. Now, when Sarah, I'm allowed to use her name, I have permission. When she was in grade 1, she had a teacher who was very, very understanding and worked very hard with Sarah and did a really good job. And she had had no experience, but just seemed to have that heart. And the other girl in grade 4, interestingly enough, her teacher had mild cerebral palsy, but still did not agree that the grade 4 girl should be in her class. That took some work. Now, the second year, there was 2 more students who came into the school. So now there's 4 in the school, and certainly at different grade levels. So there was no more than the one in the classroom at the time. And that's how it all began. We decided if we could do the 2 hardest that we knew at that time, then the rest should just fall into place.
So that early stage, were you in effect doing what people are calling today co-teaching with the regular class teacher? Like, you were in the classroom enough, working with the teacher to solve problems that you were in
Yes, I was
effect
in and out of
co-teaching?
I was in and out of the classroom with the teachers, and I supplied them with some resources and strategies and things like that. But at that time, I did not actually co-teach. I did go in the classroom a few times and work directly with a student just to model what could be done with the student in the classroom. But the co-teaching that we're talking about today, no, I didn't actually do that.
So how focused were you on making things successful in those early stages?
I think you might have called me a zealot at one time. I really believed it could work, and I was determined that it was going to work, even at sometimes very stressful days where colleagues that I had worked among and beside for years resented me. And sometimes it felt a little cool there, but we got along. We got along and it worked out. And
So,
that was the beginning.
Julie, I think before I ever met you, I heard about you.
Oh, really?
And that must be when Sarah was in your school. For those people who are watching this and remember that there were actually days before email, we had an intranet service. We didn't have email, but I got into the office one morning and there was a message from Gordon that he had sent me just after midnight the night before. He had just gotten off the phone with you, and you were spending a week together with the district psychologist, the principal, Sarah, and an expert who had been brought in from the US, John McGee.
Yes.
And what Gordon reported to me was that he described the situation that you had gone through in those days, because Sarah was, I guess, running away a lot at that point, and she was angry. And Gordon even went so far as to describe that you had scratches down your arm. And what he said in his message was, I don't understand, how they're sticking with this. but they are, and Julie reports that things are starting to change. So, you just described, your description of it until I asked this question was like, I was committed and we just did it, and I just went in and the teacher was good and everything was good. It wasn't so easy. So,
Certainly not easy.
but it's very rare, I think, to find people within school systems ready to make the commitment. I mean, I think it was Gordon at that time who was able to mobilize the resources to actually bring in an expert from the US to be able to, John's methodology was called gentle teaching. And, to be able to really direct enough resources at a child to be able to help her to be able to learn. Just talk about the challenge of that and maybe where your drive came from. And it wasn't just you, the principal was willing to be there. The psychologist at the time, Brian Kelly, was ready to be there. What motivated all of you?
Well, I had worked with Sarah at the preschool, and I actually loved her a lot. And I was comfortable around Sarah. I wasn't afraid of her. Her teacher at the time was a very big man, and he had some fears about Sarah. So before John McGee and I and Brian started that session that day, we talked to Bill, or I shouldn't be using names, sorry, talked to the teacher a fair amount about what we were trying to accomplish with Sarah, and that we were trying to give her a chance to regulate her own behavior a little bit and to calm down. She was frightened, she was scared, she would flee the room, she would climb up to the highest point that she could climb in that school. If there was a stack of chairs, she was on top of the stack and things like that. She just wanted to escape a whole lot of times, especially if there were too many people around her. So we had to deal with all of that. But the principal of the school just sort of said, we're doing this. We're going to do it. And so we all worked on it. Was it terrifically successful? Only somewhat successful. Now it worked better with some other students, but with Sarah, there was such a history with Sarah that it didn't totally work with her, I have to admit. But it did teach her to trust her classroom teacher more and to trust the principal more. I think she saw them as caring about her at that time.
It's interesting, Julie, because what you're describing almost sounds like what we still see today, right? That it has to be the individual who's motivated, who's interested. But I keep thinking, surely something has changed. What have you seen maybe over your career of, when you first brought Sarah in versus what happens now in schools? Do you see the growth? Do you see change? Are we moving ahead? Yeah.
Absolutely. The teachers don't question it anymore, not publicly anyway. Mm-hmm. And they don't act like they question it. They are more interested in what they can do to make it work in their classroom, how they can teach a student who beforehand they thought wasn't capable of learning, because that's how they were educated and that's how they were taught and that's what they knew when they grew up. That's how we saw people. But now that they've been in the system for quite a while, it just is a natural thing. They start school in grade 1, they go through the grades with their peers, and it's more comfortable. I think the biggest thing for a teacher who have different learning patterns and different challenges, they have to feel relaxed, because if they're tense, the students are tense. So they have to be comfortable with the students, all of the students, and they have to be comfortable with their curriculum, and they have to know it. They have to know the curriculum. and they have to know it well enough, and they have to have some good strategies so that they can bring to bear what they already know. And maybe a resource teacher tweaks that a little bit or gives them a little lead on how to go a different way or to try something different. But I think the biggest thing is to establish a relationship with the students. And I think the teachers try. I think they're doing a very good job. Now, there are some places where it's not as good,
Mhm.
but mostly I would have to say that it's, you know, it's coming along really, really well. A couple of hurdles that we notice is in high schools with math,
Mhm.
not so much science, although science is difficult, but math. When you're teaching logic and calculus and math subjects like that, a teacher might question, what am I supposed to do with this student? They can't even add and subtract, you know, how am I going to have them in my math class? Well, most of the time, if a student ends up in one of those classes, chances are they shouldn't be there. There should be another course that they can take, because it's putting such an expectation on the student that it's not fair.
Well,
But
the context of what you just said, you, in recent years, you've done work with high school teachers specifically. Can you tell
yes,
us a little more generally about what you did that led you to the observations that you just made?
well,
For many
I
people, the very idea that students would be included in high school classes where algebra and advanced math would be on the docket, I think is going to be a bit of a surprise. So what was the nature of your work with high school teachers, and tell us a little bit about the experience and how it went.
well, I think it lasted for 5 or 6 years or 7, I don't know. Anyway, districts would put up the money to pay supply teachers so I could come into the school and work with high school teachers one-on-one. And what I would do with the high school teacher is to get them to bring their curriculum materials with them. And I would tell them, okay, the student has a personal learning plan. Let's put that aside for now. Let's look at your curriculum and let's start working on some lessons for your class. So we would start designing some lessons in a unit of study. And as we went along, I would have them type it into their computer. We'd make a little graph and I'd say, okay, this is what the students are going to be doing. Is it going to be any different for student X? They might say no, they can join in with that. Or they might say yes, okay. So how can we include student X if it has to be a little different? Can we do partial participation? Can we reduce the amount of the task that the students are being expected to do? So if they are supposed to be writing a page of something, let's say in history or literature, could a paragraph do for the student? You know, things like that. So I just would take every day and work through a unit of study with the teachers, all the time having this student they think they're worried about in mind. And it didn't take long before teachers would say, you know, I talk too much. I've got to have the students doing more together. I'm going to have the students doing more independent work. Well, if you have the students talking together and learning from one another, that's great. And most students can take part in that. If you have individual work, students can do different things when they're working individually. And so
You did this with dozens of teachers in many different schools.
I think I did at one point, we counted them up and there was 273, but that wasn't the last year that I worked.
And that was all individual.
All individual.
So what can we extrapolate from that, like as a generalization, that the way school systems exist now, they don't really provide the means for effective coaching of teachers who are struggling with something? Like, that's sort of where my mind goes.
Yeah, I think, Gordon, when you had the is it the SST teachers that came out of the or out of the department and went to the schools and they helped teachers.
Right?
I think that that was a smart plan. It just didn't
Sorry,
last.
Julie, for those SST?
Student services team.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and there would be someone from the district or the department that would be part of that at the school. But the resource teachers that Gordon speaks about, and of which I was one, their job is supposed to be to help teachers. First of all, teachers don't have enough time to meet with them. And second of all, they're so busy with administrative work, like keeping track of the personalized learning plans, keeping track of where students are in their learning and which ones are accommodated and which ones are modified. And I stopped talking about modifications quite a long time ago. I talk about accommodations. I very rarely talk about modifications anymore.
So what was different about your work? Was it that there was a supply teacher to take the teacher's place for a half day or a day when they worked with you?
Yes, the district would give them a supply teacher day. I worked with them for whole days, one day, one long day. And by the end of the day, they had plans and they had, well, they would tell me they had a new lease on life, but you know, they might just be nice.
So Jackie, any questions about that, like linked to, I mean, now there's discussion about differentiated instruction and universal design for learning. How do you see this connected, Jackie, to what Julie's talking about?
Definitely. I mean, I think, you know, what Julie's talking about is exactly what has to happen, right? Because we throw these terms out there like differentiated instruction, universal design for learning, and we have teachers participate in a one-day workshop and then they go off into their classrooms and there's nobody there to support them, right? And I think what Julie's talking about is exactly what's needed. It's not that teachers don't want to do it or haven't learned it somehow, but it's that implementation, right? It does get to be difficult until you've been shown the way. And that's why mentor teachers or coaches are so very important. And, you know, I was excited to see that in your bio, the work that you've done, because I think especially at high school, it just feels more difficult for teachers because, as you say, you know, they want to teach calculus. And so I'm not sure how to have a student participate if they even have trouble adding numbers. So, you know, is there a way, or maybe that's not the right class for them? But those are all sorts of questions, right, that we need to work together.
And it's the right thing for some of the students to be in there.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I forgot to mention is that when I met with the teacher, I had prepared a binder, or I shouldn't say I prepared it. I made a model and the NBACL reproduced it. And I would take that binder to the school and meet with the teacher. And when we were planning, I would go through that binder and show them graphs and things that they could use in their classroom that were in the binder. So they began to see that there are resources there that they can pick and choose from, and they don't always have to count on that personal coach to be there with them if they have that resource right there at their fingertips.
Well, that's it, right? Because I think they learn, like they have that job embedded professional development that happens. And then eventually they can do it on their own, but it's hard right at the beginning. And then, you know, as is typical, I mean, we talked about this before with someone else, but if those first few chances that you try something and you fail at it, then you're going to say, oh, this isn't working, forget it.
Yeah.
So, you know, we need to have the successes, and by bringing job coaches in at the beginning and helping them, then they will learn and they will be able to do it. We've seen that across our country when we've seen school boards that move to that model. So.
And I think one of the other things now is the electronic age. Mm-hmm. There's so much more available in terms of accommodations for students. You know, they can go online and they can see pictures of what you're talking about, and they can chat with other people, and they can work, you know, do their work on the computer, and they can type instead of trying that laborious writing that some of the students just cannot do.
Yeah.
Julie, I was happy when you mentioned that your work was supported by the New Brunswick Association for Community Living that prepared these binders that you were able to use. And clearly, a lot of your leadership was not just within the school systems, but it was in the voluntary sector, both at the provincial level and the national level. Can you talk about, where you see families, both in terms of what's happening at the school, in terms of making sure that learners get supported and that teachers get a full picture of their students, not just from the academic perspective, but from hearing what families have to say, but also more broadly in terms of where you think the movement of families and organizations like the New Brunswick Association for Community Living and Inclusion Canada can support inclusive education.
Well, I'm very pleased to say, and I would imagine that Gordon would back it up. NBACL is well respected within government. So having us come to the schools and say we need to do this work has been easier, that here we are in the volunteer section and we're coming into your schools and teaching your teachers, like that. I find that parent involvement and parents, I don't like to say this to make it sound judgmental, but I think parents at elementary and middle school have more input into their students' education than they do at the high school. And there's two reasons for that. One is at high school, kids don't want their parents around. They don't want them coming in and going to meetings. The only time parents come in and go to a meeting is if there's trouble. They don't even want them to go to parent-teacher interviews. Just stay away. At least that's the way it is around here. And so they don't have the input. Many of them are frustrated. They get frustrated, especially I think the parents of students who have autism or other syndromes like that, where there is behavior involved. Parents often complain that their children are getting sent home from school too much. So at the high school, the solution to anything, if there is, like if a student has a breakdown, or if there's yelling, or if there's pushing, or anything like that, it seems that in many cases, not all, the solution is go home. And there doesn't seem to be enough of a support group in the school that can handle that and diffuse that situation. Now, many schools handle it very well, but there's a whole bunch that don't. So I think parental involvement is still very, very important. I think that parents become disenfranchised and they don't think they have any business getting involved in that.
Julie, I think you're a good example of somebody who's bridged the gap between an educator, a teacher, a school leader, and someone who's worked in the parent movement, family movement, and how bringing those two things together opens up opportunities that weren't there before. And thank you for your contribution. And
You're
I'm
very
sure
welcome.
that there's lots more you can do in the future yet.
Right. And Jackie might be interested in the ebook, Gordon.
Yeah, I'm going to mention that, folks, if you go to the Funday Regional Community Living Organization in St. John, on their site, you can find a link to an ebook on methods for teachers for inclusion that Julie put together. Actually, I think we put it on the Inclusive Education Canada Facebook page, and we're going to put it on the on our inclusion website as well.
Well, that will be nice.
Thank you for bringing that up.
It will make the Community Living Board very happy.
Yeah, well, we'll be happy to do it. And thank you for all the work you've done. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Very welcome. Nice to see you, folks.
You too. Thank you.